All right, welcome everybody to our panel on supply chain pain. Where do we go from here? I know we're still getting some people to join a little late, but I don't want to waste any time. So I know we have a lot to talk about today. My name is Kate Clowes. I work with UPS Public Affairs, and I'm currently co-chairing the Women in International Trade Supply Chain Committee with my co-chairs, Lydia Pardici and Suzanne Kane, who sadly can't make it today. But we're also excited to be partnering with OWIT, the Organization of Women in International Trade. And I have my co-chairs, Sidoni Neesmith and Kezi Mukiri, both on the call today. So you'll be hearing from Sidoni for the closing remarks. And as you can see on the screen, we have three amazing panelists that you're going to be hearing from on supply chain disruptions. We have Director Terry Edwards. She's the Area Port Director, or of the Area Port of New Orleans. We have Lauren Patelli. She's founder and principal of Baker Logistics Company. And we have Eric Churchill, my colleague from UPS. He's Vice President of Global Public Affairs. So for the first half hour, we have some prepared remarks that we're going to ask. We have Audrey Ross on the call. She's going to be our event moderator, and she'll handle some of the discussion in the first half. And then the second half, we'll have Q&A with the audience. So if you have any questions for the panelists, feel free to use the Q&A feature. I'll be checking that as well as the chat to make sure that any questions come through, we can use them for the Q&A and make sure we get some great questions for our panelists. And now I'm going to turn it over to our event moderator, Audrey Ross. She's going to further introduce the panelists and get the discussion going. Audrey is a logistics and customs specialist with Orchard Custom Beauty, and she's also the Vice President and Secretary of the International Board for OWIT. So we're excited to have her. She has great experience to lead this discussion, and I'll turn it over to you, Audrey.
Thanks so much, Kate. I'm really excited to be here. So I'm joining in from Toronto. So if our attendees want to drop in the chat where they're tuning in from as well, to sort of let us know sort of where our audience is at and from. So I'm really excited today to be joined by Director Edwards, Lauren Patelli, and Eric Churchill. So I'll give a bit of a brief, just a couple of highlights on their bios, and just things that sort of stood out to me. So for Eric Churchill, you're currently at Vice President, Public Affairs and Sustainability at UPS. And you've been there for, a few years, as most of us have been in our roles. And I just wanted to note, prior to that, you were sort of the advisor at trade strategy and trade investment and competitiveness at the World Bank. There was some work at International Monetary Fund and the Asian Development Bank. So give me one sort of thing that sort of has stood out so far in your career.
This is the first time that I've worked in, I'm based here in Washington, D.C. This is the first time I've worked in the United States, where I'm from, in about 12 years. So I was abroad. I lived in the Philippines and in Tunisia, and it gave me a really different perspective on global trade and what trade can do for people around the world. So, but it is very nice to be back and to raise my kids here in D.C.
Fantastic. It sounds like a lot of us have that sort of travel bug. So Director Edwards, it sounds like you've traveled around as well. Sort of having a post-secondary in Arkansas. We've seen you sort of now, you were in Virginia, now you're in New Orleans. So can you tell me something that sort of stood out in sort of your experience of this career?
Yeah, sure. Great. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very excited about the panel today. I've been with U.S. Customs and Border Protection for 18 years now. And the funny thing is, I started my career in Norfolk, Virginia, and that is not the way that people from Norfolk pronounce it. And then I go to DC for 12 years, and then I came to New Orleans in March of 2020. And of course, they don't say New Orleans, they say Nolans, I think. So I keep going places where I can't pronounce the names correctly, but it's been a fun ride so far.
Fantastic. And Lauren, turning over to you. So you're sort of on the consulting side, but you've sort of had a history of working with sort of freight forwarding firms, and you're a licensed customs broker as well. So tell us a little bit about the adventure that you've been on so far.
Well, thanks for the invitation and for the question. Geographically, I've made a little circle in my career. I started in Boston, I worked 10 years in New Orleans, which I loved. And I've been up in the Midwest for 20 plus years working now, and entire career in international. The fun part about being in international business is, of course, the people you meet and the places you go. So I've always been working in the United States, but I think I've been to 33 countries in my career, and hopefully a few more will get added to the list. So.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, all three of you. We'll sort of dive into some of our questions so far. Today's webinar is about kind of looking at sort of the current supply chain, the disruptions in the ports. That's things that we've been hearing about in the news, either whether you're sort of in the business or whether you're the general public. And I think today we've got, maybe sort of a mix of sort of corporate and large businesses. We've got some policy people who are very interested in that side of things. We have some small to medium enterprises, so covering things like the disruption in the ports, policies, and sort of other actions that are being undertaken, or sort of infrastructure pieces to kind of remedy the issues. And then we're sort of looking at, what from the three of you are sort of the recommendations for people who are exporting or importing into the US, so that, while we're sort of facing these challenges, maybe what are things we can do to minimize those. So I'm going to start with Director Edwards. Based on sort of your vantage point as the New Orleans Port Director, can you kind of sort of set the stage for the issues that the global supply chain is currently experiencing, and sort of what are some of the impacts sort of alongside the pandemic?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. When thinking about the global supply chain, it's really difficult to speak on behalf of the multitude of manufacturers, importers, exporters, truck drivers around the world. But I would imagine that they have experienced some of the same hardships that we see and continue to see here in the United States. Some people tend to think that due to the pandemic, shipping has gone down, but it's actually the polar opposite. Shipping traffic is up 50% from pre-pandemic levels. There's a shortage of trucks and drivers to transport the goods, higher transportation costs. Railroads are running at full capacity. It's like everybody's pitching in to do everything that they can. From a CBP standpoint, we're working diligently with the trade community and with port operators to ensure that the merchandise is cleared as efficiently as possible. CBP is available to conduct exams, and we're even willing to expand our hours of operation in order to meet that growing demand for imported goods. My number one priority is to keep my employees safe, of course, and number two is to facilitate and expedite legitimate trade and travel.
Fantastic. And I'm sure you've seen as well in CBP itself, sort of, sort of a hiring and a personnel shift and that kind of sort of employee changes related
Absolutely.
to sort of what's going on, right? The increased staffing or increased amount of entries and work and tracking and.
Absolutely. And, one of the things that I was able to do as the area port director, due to the pandemic, when we had a disruption in our international air traffic, I was able to shift all of that staffing to the cargo side of the house and, help to facilitate all of those exams that we had pending. So, we pull and tug from every direction that we can in order to provide that service that's needed by the trade community.
For sure. Let's look at Laura, and let's look at sort of what have been the effects of the current supply chain challenges on sort of the international business side, and what are some things that you're seeing among your clients?
Sure, great question. So I think as everybody knows, COVID and COVID-related challenges resulted in a big spike in demand last year. And as Director Edwards points out, the volume of cargo being brought in went up about 25%. The demand surge was due to change in consumer behavior, people shopping for hard goods rather than going out for entertainment. Plus, of course, we had a lot of stimulus money in the United States. At the same time, the carriers pulled out capacity in 2020. Planes stopped flying internationally, and carriers reduced their vessel strings and scrapped vessels early. So they reduced capacity. So what's the impact on our clients and on the importing and exporting community? It's really twofold. You got costs and you have product availability, and they've both been hit hard. When we look at costs, Asia to the West Coast right now, it's about $15,000 a container on the spot market, where normally it would be about $1,800. Logistics Management reported that truckload rates escalated over 18% nationally last year. And the forecast is that for this year, ocean freight is still going to be capacity constrained with very, very high pricing. And I have seen forecasts for LTL and FTL rate increases of around 4.5% are forecast for this year. In addition to those cost increases, because of all the disruption, there's been a lot of what I call waste in the supply chain. So we have demurrage, detention, and per diem. These are costs that people are paying now that they never budgeted for. Costs for leaving containers on the dock, for not unloading as fast as the trucking companies require, or not returning the empty equipment. We have an importing client that we're working with who spent $2 million in demurrage alone in November and December of last year. So that's money they cannot recover. They can't pass on to their customers in any way. And of course, they never anticipated.
No.
Just terrible. In this particular situation, the problem was that the factory produced a lot of goods all at one time instead of spacing it out, and there's no warehouse space available. So they had to leave the containers on the dock, exacerbating port congestion because they had no place to put all that product.
And we can think that that's sort of extrapolated for however many shippers had that idea, like, I'll bring in more inventory.
Right.
But then all of us brought in more inventory.
Yes.
Oh, I can't find a warehouse now. Oh, well, none of us can find a warehouse. So I think it sort of is this compound effect, really.
Yes, exactly. There is over ordering going on or overproduction. The demand signals got a little bit messed up and people are going haywire. And so there's a lot of challenges there. In terms of product availability, we also, at the same time people are paying big bucks, they're not getting very good service. It's really hard to get on a vessel these days. And when you do, the vessel is going to be delayed getting into berth. So what does that mean? That means the transit time is impacted. It's much longer than it used to be. And it also means things are unpredictable. So you have a lengthened supply chain. You can't plan ahead. There's delays getting into multiple ports. LA Long Beach right now, I think, has 45 vessels off the coast, and they're waiting an average of 25 to 35 days to get into berth.
Yeah. And that's lower than what it was. I mean, at one point it was over 100 vessels.
Yes. But, still, that's probably 250,000 containers, right? Yeah. So they're sitting there, and so the congestion is going to continue through spring for sure, because just to get caught up with all those containers that are sitting offshore is going to take a lot of effort.
And it's not like we can all just go and volunteer at the port. There's sort of a system and an effect to how it works.
Yeah, and I think congestion really impacts productivity, and the fact that if you have 5% of your people out with COVID, that affects productivity, and the truckers are short, so truck capacity has been really challenged. It's an aging workforce. It has 100% staff turnover anyway, and then you throw in a pandemic and a demand spike.
So you've painted us a lovely rosy picture here.
Oh, gosh. Well, there's a lot of opportunity for improvement. Let's
There we
put it
go.
that way, right?
So, and a little later in our conversation, we'll talk about some of the ways we can mitigate some of these scenarios.
Yeah.
But first, we'll hear from Eric on, Eric, can you tell us a bit some of the spillover effects? I mean, Lauren's covered some of the issues sort of around, staffing and trucking and equipment and pieces. But can you expand a little bit more on sort of the supply chain disruptions at the ports and how that is affecting other parts of the supply chain, right? And UPS maybe in particular.
Yeah, thanks, Audrey. I mean, both Director Edwards and Lauren nailed it, right? We're facing unprecedented demand. And so that you have certain places where that gets squeezed and it's so obvious to everyone. When you have 100 ships waiting off the Port of LA, there's an issue, right? What we don't see, I think what's important to recognize is that a lot of trade has worked remarkably well and continues to. CBP is clearing goods like never before.
Yeah.
We don't hear you hear about chassis, right? But you're not hearing about goods getting stuck in customs, right? And that's a testament to their work keeping things moving. We've been lucky. We at UPS, we own an airline, and our pilots have been moving around the world nonstop since the pandemic started, right? Just as you see the drivers every day on your streets, the pilots are moving those goods in and out all over the world. So much of global trade has continued in exactly the way that it should have.
Right.
But there are some spillovers that are really unintended, and not just in that Asia, that China, LA trade lane. So we hear stories. For this week, we shipped 89 million roses around the world, right? For Valentine's Day. We do a lot of business in, fresh cut flowers, in certain, fresh produce products that are pretty high value. It takes a lot of money to take those goods off of a reefer. But we hear from some of the people who have come to us, some of our customers they usually used a reefer container to send their blueberries and cherries and strawberries from South America up to the US. But those reefer containers are getting repurposed to go on that $15,000 trip between China and the US. So that impacts those customers down in South America. Can they afford to go on air cargo? Is that an option for them? Are there other options? These are the kinds of spillover effects that we're seeing and that are really difficult kinks to even out around the system. Another thing I would bring up is in Asia alone, in 2021, air cargo passenger loads were 93% below 2019 levels.
Wow.
So that is an unbelievable amount of cargo capacity in that belly cargo that is just not on the table. So our planes are full, FedEx planes are full. Anyone who can get spot on the cargo planes, it's all full, but it's at the margin where it might, those extra goods, okay, we can't get it on this plane, but we can get it on something else. Mm-hmm. That space is no longer there, and that's really problematic. So I think it's still going to take some time, especially as Asia, hopefully emerges from some of these COVID restrictions this year, but that's still going to bear on the industry.
For sure. I think, so I'm a small to medium shipper. And that's certainly something I've been faced with every day is the costs that, like Lauren mentioned, the lovely clearances that I'm getting into the US, very nice and smooth from Director Edwards and her team. But then the air cargo thing, and it's sort of, I think for most of us, you sort of think of it as like, okay, I know it's expensive, but it's still my option. And as you say, like with all of these effects, it's become not the option that we thought it was. And, I have teams who think that it's going to be the usual, well, it's air freight, it's 3 to 4 days. And I'm like, that's if it can get on a plane. I mean, I had something sit in Korea about 20 days because it was just, everything was loaded and no extra space. So, it's maybe one avenue, but it needs to be sort of implemented very strategically because it's not the sort of last minute choice that it used to be. So let's look at, we've painted a wonderful picture for everyone, but let's look a little bit at some of your recommendations to people who are sort of either exporting their US goods out into the global market, or maybe importing into the US. And so maybe what we can do to sort of minimize or there's so much unpredictability, but what are some things that we can maybe suggest that'll kind of help our sort of small, medium enterprise businesses, help our sort of the corporations, but also even from a policy perspective of if, some of our audience members are in policy or working on that kind of thought process, they can see what might help support those efforts. So we'll start with Director Edwards. So what sort of things do you think we can recommend here?
I believe one of the greatest recommendations would be a program called CTPAT. This is the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism. This program began back in 2001, and it allows CBP to work with the trade community to strengthen international supply chains and help to improve U.S. border security. We recognize that we can provide the highest level of cargo security only through those close cooperation with principal stakeholders of the international supply chain. When a company or an entity joins CTPAT, and we have about 11,400 members now, an agreement is made to work with CBP to protect the supply chain, identify security gaps, and implement specific security measures and best practices. Those applicants to CTPAT, they have to address a broad range of security topics and present security profiles that list action plans that align security throughout the supply chain. There's several benefits that come along with membership in the CTPAT program, a reduced number of CBP exams, front of the line inspections. Once you apply, you get assigned cargo supply chain security specialist that's specific to your company, shorter wait times at the border, just a number of different benefits that's available. And the best thing about it is, aside from participation being voluntary, there are no costs associated with joining the program.
But there's so many benefits, and that's
Absolutely.
maybe something for when you're sourcing different suppliers and you're looking at where am I manufacturing, what I think customers, or the customer trend has been to have a bit more transparency in our supply chains, and I'm in sort of cosmetics, and it's like, where are you getting this from? Where is this being made? Where is my stuff coming from? And so this is such an excellent program for sort of the small to medium and sort of corporate vendors to really be able to use those tools to strengthen and have maybe some more extra stability and reliability.
Absolutely. And it's easy to join. The process is it's lengthy, but it's so worth it. The first step is just for the company to review those CTPAT minimum security criteria for their business entity, and then submit an application through the portal, which is online. Everything's online. And then the third step is to complete a supply chain security profile. Once that's done, then we'll take over and go through the application process with you step by step. So it's definitely worth it.
Another thing that that CBP does is that so brands might find interesting too is you have a program as well for registering brands or registering trademark goods. Is that right?
Yes.
Sort of like a little level IP kind of protection piece.
Yes. And I'm sorry, I do not know the exact name of that program, but I do know it is available.
Yeah, so there's sort of a number of levels of sort of security and peace of mind that CBP can really offer and contribute to.
Absolutely.
Amazing. So let's head to Lauren, and you're working with sort of a wide range of sort of global entities and enterprises. So what are some of your recommendations, either from exporting out or importing in?
Okay, great. So I kind of put the recommendations into two buckets. One is the immediate actions to take now, and then kind of a medium-term view of what to do for the rest of the year. For immediate actions to do now, what's I think is terribly important is for people to face reality. So you want to make sure that you're not over promising, right?
Yes.
So promise what you can deliver. Another thing that we tell people to is seize any opportunity that you can find. Little wins add up. So if you can't save money right now on, say, your full truckload, look at your small parcel. If you are running out of warehouse space in, one area, perhaps explore another. Seize what little opportunities are out there. As you mentioned, prioritize your goods, right? Don't worry about the slow moving, bulky stuff. Worry about your high velocity, high value items and prioritize them. And then the last immediate action is to make sure that you're really collaborating with your vendors and your clients. You want to reset everybody's expectations. You want to find ways to work together, because the impact that you face, they're facing also. And, it's important to know you're not alone. Everybody's in the same situation right now. Find ways to work together. When I think about the medium term, I would say it's important for people to realize that capacity is king these days, and the carriers really are in control. So you want to make sure that you're going to be a shipper of choice. What does that mean? Focusing on more than price. Forecast. And then lastly, be a good steward of their equipment and their drivers. This is a precious commodity to them. And so make sure the driver has a good experience when he backs into your DC. Unload equipment and return it promptly. Do what you can to make the entire supply chain work more smoothly. And then the last thing is really about resilience. So you want to diversify what you can. If you can, diversify your sourcing plants, your sourcing locations. Very important. Diversify how you bring freight into the country. So there's only 3 alliances that bring freight into the United States. So there's 11 carriers that have 80% of the global transportation. They're on 3 vessel sharing agreements. So you want to make sure you're diversified across alliances, diversified across carriers, and also diversified by port of arrival. We have an ILA contract negotiation coming up at the end of June. So there could be disruption on the West Coast of the United States. Do you have shipments moving to the Gulf where the director is based? Do you have cargo moving to the East Coast so that you have access to capacity if there is disruption? You want to review your levels of safety stock for the exact same reason. And then I would say the one other thing is people tend to forget about that. Just like your vendors are impacted by COVID and they have labor shortages, keep your eye on your people. You want to make sure that you are adequately staffed. So be flexible, be creative with your people, do what you can to retain them and enhance their skills. So.
Fantastic. I'm taking notes from everybody if I could, but I have to moderate. So I'll have to look at this later. Jumping over to Eric. So same thing, sort of what are you seeing? What do you recommend? Lauren gave us some really great touch points here. So what about exporting, importing? Give us your thoughts.
I look back recently at what was said about global supply chains after the Fukushima disaster in 2011 in Japan. And almost all the recommendations that Lauren spoke about are found in those recommendations, right? There is the only difference with COVID and with the supply chain crisis that we're facing now is that it's spread across many more nodes, right? Which exacerbates it and makes it worse. But this transparency, understanding your supply chain, as Lauren said, building that resiliency into your supply chain, understanding where risks might come from, whether it's location-related risks, increasingly climate-related risks, they might be labor-related risks, understanding how to mitigate those. So having different strategies. So sometimes they're going to be downstream in your inventory management, and sometimes they're going to be upstream or at source of production and automation and things like that. So fully understanding that, I think, is really key. I wanted to bring up something else, though, which is that I think from a policy perspective, there are some pretty remarkable things that have happened since COVID. And I think particularly the health space offers some lessons for us. And I think that the trade community should use those lessons to try and affect change. But UPS, we're proud, and I'll give another plug. We don't just deliver flowers. We've delivered 1.3 billion vaccines around the world to date. And those vaccines are delivered on time because customs agencies around the world have recognized how critical it is to get those supplies through. The same has been true for PPE, or at earlier stages of the pandemic. It's been true for medical supplies like ventilators, where crises have erupted in different parts of the world. Country authorities understood how important it was to get those goods through, right? To reduce tariffs, to clear lanes, to make sure that those things could get cleared and to people that needed them. And I think we can take a lot of those lessons about how quickly action was taken and decisively. And if we would spread those to other areas of our trade policy, we could have a much more seamless approach to global trade that would really benefit customers. It would lower costs, and it would give a lot more opportunities for traders to diversify around the world.
I think, and sort of what I'm hearing from all three of the perspectives is sort of a level of collaboration that I think in sort of previous years, we all sort of entered into a space that we thought we had to be very competitive. And in being competitive, we thought that meant being very protective and private and exclusive. And I think sort of what's maybe the benefit shift in sort of coming through this pandemic has been this collaboration where we do see places that might have had sort of stalemates or certain parties and silos acting very independently or very exclusively to each other, and very much focused on what their priorities were. And then sort of what I'm hearing from the three of you is that we can see that, between agencies, between policymakers, between businesses and private enterprises, we're really seeing sort of more of a collaborative effort and a sharing to really achieve these goals. And I think sort of what you're saying, Eric, is that this is sort of can be the inspiration maybe moving forward for some of the policy changes that need to happen in maybe the pain points that seem very obvious to sort of our market space. Do anyone agree, disagree with that?
I fully agree, Audrey. And it gets back to what I said at the top, which is that the problems in the supply chain spill over into other parts of the supply chain. Thus, it's so important for the agencies, for the policymakers, and for the business community to be connected together, because a problem doesn't just stay in one location. It spreads to different sectors. It spreads to different, and you never know, is this going to be something that's going to affect a product that's health related? Is it going to be a product that's perishable? And those are going to have different policy implications, depending on where in the supply chain the problem is. So coordination is absolutely key.
Lauren, any thought on that?
So I fully agree. The other thing I want to point out is I think in the past, we didn't invest in ourselves as a country.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And we didn't invest in our infrastructure for sure.
Yeah.
So now we have a crisis, and the good news is that we're finally at least putting in some money for bridge repair and rail expansion and port upgrades that we so desperately need in the United States. And I do think that a crisis is a time when people reevaluate Where do they
Mhm.
want to spend their time, their energy, their money? And I guess the good news is that, supply chain's been in the news for the last 12 months. And so we are finally going to correct some of the problems and deficiencies that we have here.
Absolutely. And Director Edwards, maybe a last word on that, and then we'll move into some other questions.
Yes, I agree as well. And there's a phrase that I say at least once a week. We're going to come out on the other side of this pandemic much smarter. And that's from a business standpoint as well as in our personal lives. I think that there's a lot of lessons learned. We can take those best practices and use them to our advantage. Communication is key. Coordination is key. And we're smart people. We can do this. So I'm going to remain optimistic and hope that this supply chain disruption ends a lot sooner than we anticipate.
Fantastic. So let's jump into, we've got a few sort of Q&A coming in from the audience so that we'd love to kind of get sort of what their experience is and some insights from our three excellent panelists here. I will shout out, I see a lot of people in from Toronto, so that's nice for me tuning in. And we've got someone in from Serbia and from Maryland and also from Nigeria. So it's a very exciting assembly that we have today. So our first question is to you, Director Edwards. Could you comment on sort of which U.S. ports are more congested and have some of the most challenges, maybe regarding their infrastructure and services? And have you seen a lot of businesses sort of trying to change and pivot their port and really choosing sort of New Orleans or some of the other Gulf Coast ports?
Well, it's difficult to speak on the situations that are going on at other ports unless it's someone within my region. Of course, we see what's going on out at LA Long Beach with the backlog there. And I've read quite a bit about that and the ways that they're trying to alleviate some of this. But as far as importers pivoting to other places, port shopping is real. So yeah, you do find a lot that are trying to find these ports where the backlog is not as significant as it would be, in LA Long Beach or, up in the Newark or New York area. So yeah, they do try to come to those ports. And honestly, I have not seen much of a backlog here in New Orleans. I can walk down to the river and I don't see ships out there waiting to come in. So, we're open, we're ready for business. Everything's buzzing around here. And then I work closely with the ports all along the Gulf Coast. And, we have conversations at least once a week, just talking about different issues. And they would basically say the same thing. We're available, it's open, come on down.
Yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting shift to see sort of it's and sort of typical to our industry. This is what was always done, right? Hitting through that West Coast area, like that's what we've always done. So it's sort of interesting to see that switch into. It turns out there are a whole lot of other ports in the U.S. that we could be exploring. And so a second sort of a follow up for Lauren. Have you seen importers sort of switch in through Panama and hitting into the East Coast to avoid it?
So it's very difficult once you have signed your ocean contracts to change from, a specific port and allocation to another. So if a customer was already diversified, where they had a certain percentage going to East Coast all water and West Coast, then yes, of course, obviously they have a strategy, they're following that strategy. But space is tight to every port. So the backlogs are worse in LA Long Beach because they have the most ships coming in there from Asia. But, other ports, Savannah, Charleston, Seattle, Prince Rupert, they have periodically had vessels waiting for berth.
Yeah.
I just think it's important to try to, if you don't have a diversification strategy in place, you need to be working toward that very quickly to sign this year's contracts. There's really no time to waste at this point.
And another sort of a question, we'll start with Eric. Maybe, are you seeing sort of the emerging trend? I mean, we hear about this sort of, reshoring, sureshoring, nearshoring. Are you seeing businesses sort of start to consider that, or seeing more sort of maybe local sort of manufacturing or support systems sort of crop up, or is that still very much sort of an on the horizon or a maybe later kind of situation?
I think what we're seeing is the benefits of the different regional trade alliances that have kind of been formed over the last few years. So we have broader trends. So for example, the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Agreement for that China is at the center of, and Southeast Asia, you see a lot of production that will concentrate in that area. With USMCA, US, Mexico, Canada corridor, you see regionalization, but we don't necessarily see, which is a kind of a form of nearshoring. And I think just because the incentives are aligned for that. I don't think that there's been so much talk about reshoring, and we don't see it. It's not something that we see in our business. I'm sure there are examples of it, and there's legislation obviously on semiconductors, but that seems more the exception than the rule, and it's due to very specific kind of national security concerns, as opposed to something that's driven by the market and that is trade, where the trade incentives are making it better for people to reshore.
Right. Interesting. Lauren, any thoughts on that? Sort of that kind of, is it just something people talk about, or is it actually happening?
Well, I guess I have a few thoughts. I mean, I would say, first of all, in terms of nearshoring, I think what happened with the Trump tariffs is many importers from China were bringing in inexpensive goods. They shifted their production to Vietnam, more than shifting it to, say, Mexico.
Yeah.
I do think, though, that when we look at the tariff impact and the supply chain delay and the costs, that the assumptions that businesses made 10 years ago when they decided to offshore may no longer be valid. So it would certainly be worthwhile for an importer to reassess their cost of production and their total cost and compare it to doing it here in the United States and see, whether their original decision is still the right decision for their company.
For sure. For sure. Not just how we always did it, but, how are we going to move forward? Right.
Right. Exactly. Because the costs have all changed. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the production costs in sort of China, there was always sort of this assumption that, labor costs over in this other area are a lot less expensive, and that may not be true anymore. And then there's also, we sort of touched on it a bit earlier, maybe climate considerations, right? In sort of what does the future look like? What is it going to look like in 2050? And maybe now's that opportunity.
Yeah.
I would just say, I agree with Lauren. I think she makes some really important points, but I think it's important to note how sticky the supplier relationships are. I mean, when you build a relationship with a supplier, you don't want to break that if it's reliable, and it does take a really significant increase, right? Because and that's what we've seen in China, where labor costs have risen really dramatically over the last 10 or 15 years, and yet those supplier relationships have remained so solid, because it's hard to find other suppliers in different countries. That's a difficult, expensive, long process.
I think that's the thing that we forget. It wasn't that we sort of businesses just all of a sudden overnight outsourced to these places. It was a gradual, decades-long process of building offices, building relationships, building these tie-ins. And so this sort of overnight idea of like, this will solve your supply chain by bringing it here. And you're like, but I don't know anybody here who makes plastic componentry. And I don't know anybody here who does, this. So yeah, I mean, that's such a, it's a trend topic. It's sort of a hot topic, but whether we're actually, is it going to be implemented? I think the considerations you brought up too, is it really market driven? Is it sort of policy driven? Is it security driven? And then what is sort of your business plan or your product that you're dealing with? I mean, I'm dealing with brow gels and lipsticks. So my considerations for local manufacturing might be different than, of course, automotive, semiconductors, and sort of larger machinery. So, you know, we have to certainly be introspective on that. A question I have coming in, are companies in the sort of express industry, maybe that's sort of small packages, so UPS, FedEx, Amazon, is there sort of a level of collaboration that's happening now, maybe that you haven't seen, or is there you know, sort of a working together to solve some of the sort of capacity or cost issues?
On the cost issues, I think there are some antitrust rules that would forbid us from
Oh.
collaborating with them on
Really
that. But I would, but there are some on the policy space, and I'll give you an example. One of the real challenges that we've faced over the last 2 years is getting our pilots in and out of countries.
Okay.
And with quarantine requirements, testing requirements, vaccination requirements, all shifting sometimes day to day, and sometimes based on country of origin. So our flight patterns have been affected. You know, if you're flying from east to west versus west to east, and the country that you're flying from is now subject to a quarantine as opposed to the country that you're flying to. Can you reverse that? Those are really hard problems to solve, and you know, we've worked through those. But I think as an industry, what we would like to see going forward and to see some leadership on is a common set of safe rules.
Right.
For the express delivery segment, where we could see how do we make sure that the cargo space is protected and can continue to operate, and using, you know, and there can be a lot of different safety mechanisms in place depending on the level of relative risk, but making sure that those systems are set up, that they're transparent, clear, and predictable for us as we move goods around the world. I think that's the area where we would where we collaborate most, I think, at this point with our competitors.
For sure. And because it does, you know, like the ports, like some of these policy decisions, there's sort of, you know, there's a regional, so there's sort of an American sort of grouping of companies or of associations, but then there's also sort of this global matrix as well. And so you have things like, you know, I mean, I'm familiar with sort of like IATA, but that doesn't cover everything, right? And so it seems to be there's a lot of sort of separate associations, and I think maybe that moving forward is one of the challenges in your role. Is this, can we collaborate at that level and agree to these sort of maybe standardized or, you know, acceptable limits or regulations, which again is a space that hasn't maybe before been as collaborative or cooperative. So that'll be interesting to see how that changes. We've got another sort of port question. I mean, talking about productivity at the ports, I mean, you know, Director Edwards, maybe can you speak to this? Some of the, you know, is there a level of maybe it's automation or digitization that maybe some ports are lacking? And I mean, infrastructure is not necessarily your direct you know, spot, but maybe for what CBP is doing in the space of sort of automation or you know, maybe sort of single window or that kind of piece that could relate to productivity sort of around your space or your port.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it is difficult to speak about the infrastructure, say at the port here in New Orleans, because that's a little outside my lane. But what we're doing, you know, CBP is tasked with keeping any products that are that may pose a threat to the safety and security of this nation out. So we have several layers of security that we follow, whether it's targeting shipments, looking at those manifests, combing through them to see if everything looks as it should be, whether it's scanning containers after they arrive. And when it comes to that, we try to stay on the cutting edge of technology, and it helps to actually speed up the process for us because we get clear pictures of the contents of a container, whereas you look back 10, 15, 20 years ago, you have to manually open the container and climb through it. I mean, I spent my days doing that as well. But with technology, we are able to, and I know this is cliche, but we are able to work smarter instead of working harder. So CBP always wants to stay on the front end of technology, and that, of course, helps our trade community.
Nice. A question for sort of for Lauren and Eric. We can start with Lauren. Are there any recommendations for like the very small, very small to medium-sized businesses dealing with these supply chain disruptions? I mean, Lauren, you gave us a great list of where to start, but sometimes, for small, they're not going to be able to get that contract with the carrier directly, right? So is there kind of a little tip for them on what they can do based on their size?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So I think that what's most important is really to use all the resources that are at your disposal. Whether you're a small business or a medium-sized business, you can get resources from the government. In addition to, professionals at CBP, there's all sorts of federal and state support available to assist businesses in growth. You have industry associations.
Yeah.
And then you have associations like OIT and WIT, where members can come together and get information. And then lastly, you have, independent advisors such as consulting companies. So, work your network, communicate, ask for help, and remember you're not alone.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you dropped WIT and OIT.
But this is the value, right? This is the value of these organizations is that, people get ideas, they make connections, and they use information and their resources as best they can to improve their circumstance.
Yeah, fantastic. Eric, anything to add to that? Any tips for sort of the smaller participants?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I like Lauren's response a lot. I think that's those kinds of resources are incredibly helpful, and that's where we refer so many of our small businesses to around the world. I think that some people balk. I think especially in the express delivery segment, which is just by nature more expensive than maritime shipping. They balk at price, and one of the things that we try and help our customers with is things we've talked about earlier. Inventory management is really key. Warehousing. I mean, you're looking at anywhere where you can bring down costs, and sometimes it might not be the shipping itself that's going to be lower, but if you can work with your bank on the trade finance side, if you can work on the warehousing to make sure that's in order, so you can lower your your distribution costs after you've crossed the border. Those are all strategies that can keep your costs lower. Even in an environment which is obviously difficult in terms of the volume that's going through the system.
For sure. And sort of our last question, because amazingly we're running out of time. But do you think that exporters from developing countries sort of globally, do you think there'll be sort of more opportunities to sell to North America as sort of we see sort of American importers looking to diversify, right? So we've sort of all corralled into sort of an East Asian market. What do you think about, we've got Africa has a new internal free trade agreement coming in. So we're seeing a lot more development on exports and and that in that region. The sort of European market, we've seen a UK US sort of trade deal sort of is in talks. What do you think? We'll start with maybe Director Edwards. Any thoughts on that, on the opportunities for sort of the exporters in the global region to come into the American market?
Yeah, absolutely. We have an international affairs division that sends CBP representatives to various countries to help them with their trade setup. And a lot of these are emerging markets. And I believe that we will definitely see a significant rise in trade or imports coming in from those countries.
That's such a great resource to have. Over to you, Eric.
Absolutely. I mean, 100%. I think there's, just in e-commerce alone, we have just seen such an explosion in the last couple of years for obvious reasons. But just an immense diversity of traders have come into the market and are able to, because of digital technology, it's so much easier to create those relationships that we were talking about earlier. It's so much more seamless, and the cost is just as high talking to someone on Zoom in Accra versus Shanghai. So it's you no longer need to be part of the trade delegation to do that. I think there's tremendous opportunities. I mean, I think the only thing that we'd like to see is, as you mentioned, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is fantastic. This is going to absolutely help African traders, and we need more of those kinds of agreements. It's really important for the trade community to keep at it, pushing our governments where we're working to help them understand the benefits of trade to small businesses and for employment around the world.
Fantastic. Lauren, a last word on that?
I feel like one of the advantages of the internet is that it has allowed a lot of small brands overseas to directly tap into the American market and to sell. You don't even need an Amazon. You can sell directly to the American consumer. You can process your transactions on your website using back-end tools, and a lot of really small brands are able to get traction. They advertise on Facebook. They're the American consumer is interested in knowing where their goods come from. A lot of people like to buy things that are a little bit more unique, perhaps have a human touch to them, and the internet facilitates that. So I anticipate that business will continue to grow, actually.
Amazing. And I think the sort of key thing is that everyone keeps the compliance piece in mind and uses the sort of information and resources from groups like CBP to kind of make sure that we're all understanding the rules.
Absolutely.
Audrey, let me just make one plug on that. It works both ways too. It's not just traders, from
out to in
developing countries coming into the U.S. It's U.S. traders, right? And we're seeing this with small businesses all over, finding new markets.
Yeah, it helps with growth.
Yeah, that's a very good point. There's a huge amount of American products bought by Chinese consumers that go out small pack. So it does indeed go both directions.
Which is exciting to see, sort of a great shift sort of coming through. So I want to thank all three of you for joining us, just really getting your insights, because you're in these sort of high level and very sort of intense positions, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Sidoni to kind of give us some closing remarks here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Audrey. Thank you. My name is Sidoni Naismith, and I serve alongside Kezi Mukuri as co-VPs of programming for OIT International. So on behalf of WIT and OIT, we want to thank our amazing panelists and our moderator for sharing their knowledge and incredible insights with us today on this great, wonderful supply chain topic. And we want to also thank you, our attendees, for your support in showing up for this webinar. Please continue to join WIT and OIT for future events. For WIT, there's an upcoming event on February 23rd. It's entitled CPTPP Roadmap to Growth for Countries and Workers. And on March 10th at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, in celebration of International Women's Day, OIT International will be hosting a webinar around the topic of driving inclusion in international trade and business to facilitate sustainable development. So some really good programs there that's coming your way. We ask that you continue to visit the website, not only to learn about the event, but also to continue to learn about the organizations. WIT's website is wit.org, wit.org, and OIT's website is owit.org, owit.org. And again, we thank you for joining, and we continue to serve you. So thank you and have a wonderful day. Make it great.